Hello, good evening. This is the lecture 9 or meeting 9. Well, not meeting, it's the non-meeting number 9 after several non-meetings, admittedly, of the Marx MA module, session number 9, where we are looking at the first chapter of Capital. Sorry for the delay. I found it surprisingly hard to do this, to give a lecture basically watching myself and nobody else in the room. I mean, I'm used to small numbers of people in attendance when I give lectures, but not nobody. So that's a novum. That's a new high or a new low, depending on how you see it. I'm curious to hear how you find it watching this stuff. As you know, the first volume of Capital is one of the relatively few texts that Marx actually finished, completed, polished, and prepared for publication. So obviously considered one of his absolute key works. And the first chapter has a reputation for being particularly difficult, but also particularly rewarding in a number of ways. And so it pays. It is worthwhile reading this very closely and very carefully, because you can get just from the first chapter of Capital, Volume 1, you can get a very good sense of the style of Marx's thinking and writing, and of obviously you get an impression of several of the key concepts of his analysis of capitalist modernity. So the idea here is not me giving a dazzling lecture with lots of information of all sorts, but simply the idea is that I talk you through the text. Or rather, I talk you through some passages of the text, so you will have to read the entire thing for yourself as well, of course, but I would like to hope that the lecture helps you reading the whole thing. You will find that the text is actually somewhat repetitive, so Marx has a habit of going through the same kind of argument or through the same basic points in iterations several times, which you will find is actually a relief, because you will inevitably struggle to understand what he writes on first reading, and you will find the more often he repeats his points with a slightly different angle, from a slightly different perspective, in variations, as you wish, a bit like a piece of music, or almost that where you have a theme that comes in variations, and after so many iterations you finally get what the theme is. So it works like that here as well. So obviously I'm leaving out the repetition, so I only focus on some of the key passages of the text, and you will have to go through the entire thing for yourself, which becomes easier partly because of the repetitions that are there. So here it is. This is the title page of the translation that we're using. As you know, there's several translations. This is the older one we're using, partly simply because it is free, because it is out of copyright, because of its age, and partly also because in many passages I find it is the more accurate of the available translations. Obviously you have to keep in mind, when you read something like this, you are reading a translation. So every classic work of social thought will always have translation issues. Every translation is imperfect, and you will always have to do more studying of secondary materials, scholarly commentary, etc., to figure out the things that you're missing, that are lost in the translation. Anyway, we are trying to we are working with this translation only, and that's what we have to make do with. So the book is called Capital, A Critique of Political Economy. Just that is already quite already just the title contains enough words that are worth considering. So the word capital obviously will be explained later on in the book. It's actually in the first chapter that we're looking at. The word capital will hardly occur because Marx begins with what he considers to be more basic categories that later lead him to the construction of the concept of capital. What he calls his work is a critique of political economy. So first thing to note here is that the book is a critique of something. So it is something that is basically intended to be negative, something that is intended to take apart a certain object. So the word critique has obviously several meanings in social theory. You could say there are different types of critiques in Marx's writing, in particular two that occur sometimes one at a time, and sometimes they occur sort of rolled into each other. One form of critique is a sort of analytical critique that looks at a text or an object. Very often here the objects are texts, because that's what Marx does. That's the same what we do. We look at texts and we critique these texts, and we critique them imminently to see how consistent a particular argument is. That's what you are supposed to do in your essay writing. You are critiquing somebody else's positions expressed in texts, and the first thing you do is this coherent? Is there actually a coherent argument? So that is one form of critique that Marx engages in, a critique of an object called political economy. The second type of critique is a critique that is more contextual rather than text immanent. That means that you look at the text, and again, this is what you are expected to do in your essay writing and in your scholarly work, what everybody is expected to do. You put that text into its context, and that context is, of course, in the first place, society and history. So there's a societal, historical context, and you put that text in relation to its context and see whether it makes sense, or what kind of sense it makes in its particular societal, historical context. And from that analysis, from both these types of critical analysis, you then formulate criticisms of that position that you're engaging with, and that's what Marx is doing. Now the question is, what is this object political economy? Again, that also can have two different meanings. On the one hand, political economy is the name of a new academic discipline that originated in the 18th century and was widely considered to be the discipline that most directly deals with the structure and the dynamics of the new type of society that was emerging in the 18th and then more intensely in the 19th century. And that is the society that we live in, modern capitalist bourgeois society. So political economy is the modern new science that tries to understand what this new type of society actually is. And that is the object of Marx's critique here. So he looks at this body of social science, basically the original social science, because it predates sociology, economics, politics, psychology. All these things are basically derivative of what in the 18th century comes to be known as political economy. So that is, in the first place, the object of critique of what Marx is doing here. And then the second meaning could also be, you can say, you could talk about the political economy of say England, in which case you're not talking about an academic discipline, but you're actually talking about the object of that discipline itself. So you could say political economy of this or that country, say, that is the structures and dynamics of that particular society itself. And that is, of course, also what Marx is doing in this text. So he's doing the second thing by way of doing the first thing. And again, that is what scholars do. So usually we look at texts, but we look at texts of which we think that their analysis points to something that is actually relevant in reality. So we critique reality through the critique of texts, or the body of texts, in this case, that constitutes a particular social scientific discipline, political economy. So that is roughly what at least the second line of the title. We have left out the word capital because it's too complicated to start with. So we have sort of looked at the first 5 words here, so which is a promising start, you will surely agree. So we are looking at the first section of volume 1, called The Process of Capitalist Production. Again, interesting to point out that the primary object of the analysis is a mode of production. That is where the emphasis of the analysis lies. Then we are informed here that this is translated from the 3rd German edition. So for proper Marxologists deal with how all these different editions of the work and also the different translations, how they all differ from each other. That is a small science in its own right, Marxology, but we're not dealing with that, obviously. And you can see here that the English translation was actually this English translation, and that is one of the reasons for me to use this one, is it was actually supervised by Engels himself in his very old age, etc. So we need now to jump forward. We jump over all the various forewords and prefaces, etc., etc., etc. And the text begins here on page 41, Book 1, Capitalist Production. So again, this is where the whole thing starts, with an analysis of production. Which sort of gives you a hint that the theory that Marx is developing is primarily a critique of a particular mode of production, not primarily a critique of some particular, this is rather annoying, not a critique of, say, distribution, for example, or a critique of injustice or something. No, it is primarily an analysis and a critique of a mode of production. So part 1 of the first book, so as you know, the Capital as we have it exists of 3 books. Only the first book was completed by Marx himself. The other 2 volumes were edited by Engels and then others after Marx's death, actually. And this process of editing unfinished drafts by Marx is actually still continuing. Still today there's a small army of scholars working on Marx's manuscripts and editing more and more of them and producing critical editions that satisfy proper academic standards. So we have part 1 called Commodities and Money. That is the subject matter with which Marx begins, and these are, as he explains in the various prefaces, where he explains his method and his approach of presenting the results of his research. These are in Marx's view, the most basic and simple categories for the analysis of the capitalist mode of production. So rather than beginning with capital, he begins with the concept of commodities and then the concept of money, which is more or less derived from that of commodities. And chapter 1 is therefore called Commodities. Now, section 1 of chapter 1 of book 1 of volume 1 of Capital is called the 2 factors of the commodity, use value and value. In brackets, the substance of value and the magnitude of value. So you can see even just from these section headings, this is all presented in a very analytical language, although there's also a lot of sarcastic commentary in there, especially in the footnotes. It's always very much worthwhile in Marx's writings to read the footnotes, because often the fun stuff is happening there, where he's kind of attacking and making fun of other people in particular. Both political economists, which are what you might or you could address as bourgeois thinkers of the time, and perhaps even much more so, socialists, the thinkers of the labor movement of the time, of which Marx himself obviously was one. So he's one of the Marx's favorite pastimes was certainly polemicizing against basically his comrades and those amongst those who he thought got the categories of understanding the capitalist society wrong in some way, or in one way or other, which was pretty much most of them. So if you look at Marx's collected works, about half of this, which is quite voluminous, consists of polemics against other socialists. Whereas, as you will see when you read especially Capital, you will see that he treats the representatives of bourgeois science quite often with quite a lot of respect, especially when he credits them with actually understanding what this new thing modern bourgeois society is and how it works, what are the categories for its analysis. So he polemicizes and makes fun of many of them, but he is also very appreciative and actually sometimes even quite polite towards some of them, of the classical authors of political economy. Now the first sentence begins with the words, "the wealth of those societies in which the capitalist mode of production prevails presents itself as, quote, an immense accumulation of commodities." The quote is actually from himself, so Marx is here on the first page, in the first sentence, quoting himself with a formulation that he seems to think highly of. And then he continues, its unit being a single commodity. Our investigation must therefore begin with the analysis of a commodity. Or rather, the German text reads, the analysis of the commodity. Because obviously it is not the analysis of a commodity, it is the analysis of the concept of the commodity. So, as I said, we're working here with translations which are always imperfect, but this one is reasonably okay. Small things notwithstanding. So the first word, and that is worth pointing out, is wealth. So basically, political economy and also the critique of political economy is in the first instance a science of wealth, an analysis of what constitutes wealth in a particular society. So it's quite interesting to look at this first sentence, because it tells you already an enormous amount of what's to be expected here. It is an analysis of wealth, but an analysis of wealth specific to a particular type of societies, namely those societies in which the capitalist mode of production prevails. The capitalist mode of production is the thing that nowadays people usually call capitalism. It's worth noting that the word capitalism didn't or hardly existed at the time, and is not used at all, or at least very, very rarely by Marx himself. So in German, actually, the word capitalism didn't exist at the time. I think it did exist in French already in this period, but not in German, possibly in English, but Marx is not using the word capitalism. That is quite interesting, because if you talk about an ism, you have a much stronger sense of something sort of closed and systemic. What Marx is talking about is a mode of production. And then he gives another hint as to how he considers this mode of production. He says societies in which this, the capitalist mode of production, prevails. Now prevails obviously tells you that there might be other modes of production in existence at the same time in those societies that we're looking at. So you can get a sense that you could have modern societies in which the capitalist mode of production prevails more or less. There might be differences between such particular societies, but the object of Marx's analysis is those societies in which it does prevail over others, implying that others might also exist there in these societies. Now what characterizes these societies is that wealth presents itself as an immense accumulation of commodities. So this formulation, where he quotes himself, being very pleased with his formulation here, obviously, is slightly sarcastic by sound, I think. So there is sort of a hint of sarcasm in this. So basically, the wealth of these societies consists in heaps of stuff. Basically, I think that is the sort of implication here in the way it is formulated. And the unit of this stuff, this accumulation of commodities, is the commodity. And that is therefore, because it is the principal unit of what constitutes wealth, it must be the starting point of the analysis. That's what he's saying here in the first sentence. So we get from this, we're looking at wealth as it appears or presents itself in a particular type of society, not in any society. Very important, this point, because we can conclude from the way this is formulated that Marx thinks that in other types of societies wealth might mean something else. Wealth might not mean a heap of commodities. It might mean something entirely different. And that goes both for societies that would have preceded modern capitalist society, or possibly societies that might come after that type of society if at some point it disappears for whatever reason. So the subject matter is basically the form wealth takes in a particular type of society, with the implication to be kept in the back of the mind that in other types of societies wealth might take or would take other forms. So the next sentence is a definition of what this basic unit of wealth is, namely the commodity. In the first place, it's an object. Oh, actually, I was intending to use this underlining function here. So, here we go. Commodity, right? So I completely forgot my cunning plan to do these underlining bits, a bit like you would when you read the text, right? So what I find important here, mode of production is one of the keywords. These are the keywords here. So wealth, mode of production, and commodity, obviously. So a commodity is in the first place an object outside us. That's interesting. So it's something that we face, or something that faces us, which is of course what the word object literally means. A thing that by its properties satisfies human wants. Obviously human wants would again be a key concept that we need to think about what it means, of some sort or another. The nature of such wants, whether for instance they spring from the stomach or from fancy. So we have two types of human wants. From the stomachs, basically bodily wants. We need to eat, to drink, to sleep. We need some warmth, etc. Or from fancy. Fancy basically meaning the imagination. I think we would use the word imagination here. So we have imaginary wants. That is quite interesting. We are still on the first page of basically in the third sentence now, and we learn here, perhaps somewhat surprisingly, that Marx considers things that we only imagine possibly also to be human wants. So not just the bodily sort of, if you like, physical necessities, but also necessities that come basically from our imagination. They are things that commodities address or relate to, in a sense. Neither are we here concerned to know how the object satisfies these wants, whether directly as means of subsistence or indirectly as means of production. So there's again a differentiation. So you can already tell this is going all the time like this. So he introduces a concept, and then he introduces differentiations within that concept to describe what different forms this concept can take. So we have here commodities falling in two groups: means of subsistence, basically things that we consume, and means of production. So if I buy a machine to produce something, that is also a commodity, but I don't consume that product, that commodity in the way I consume food and drink, but it goes into the production of other commodities, whereby it is also gradually consumed again, but it is not consumed by myself in the way I consume my lunch. So this is a differentiation within the concept of the commodity. Now, every useful thing, as iron, paper, etc., may be looked at from the 2 points of view of quality and quantity. Again, we have here a concept being introduced, useful thing, and we find two ways of looking at useful things introduced, namely in terms of quality, what it is, and quantity, how much of something a useful thing is. It is an assemblage of many properties and may therefore be of use in various ways. Now, here comes an interesting sentence. To discover the various use of things is the work of history. That is interesting because, again, it kind of introduces or emphasizes the historicity of things and how we use them. Just as well as Marx also thinks, that doesn't say that here displays, but that the wants are also a product of history. So people in different societies, in different historical periods, have different wants, and also they find different ways of satisfying them. So all these concepts have basically history somewhat central to them. So also is the establishment of socially recognized standards of measure for the quantities of these useful objects. So we have here basically the statement that every society establishes what are useful things after it has already established what are the wants. So what wants do we need to address in society? What are the things with which we can address them? And how can we measure the quantities of these objects? The diversity of these measures has its origin partly in the nature of these objects that are to be measured, and partly in convention. Convention meaning obviously society, or although society in history is already in these objects themselves, because obviously we need to find these useful things and we have to find out for what they are useful. And obviously the same thing, as he says here, can be useful for a whole variety of different things, depending on what we need. So here comes now the first, or not the first, further, the next definition, the utility meaning basically usefulness of a thing makes it a use value. So use value is a technical term taken from political economy. But this utility is not a thing of air, being limited by the physical properties of the commodity. It has no existence apart from that commodity. So usefulness or utility is something that is connected to the specific materiality of that thing. A commodity such as iron, corn or diamond is therefore, so far as it is a material thing, a use value, something useful. So the words that do the heavy lifting here are so far as they are material, concrete, specific things. And to that extent they are useful. This property of a commodity is independent of the amount of labor required to appropriate its useful qualities. So a thing either is useful or it isn't useful. It doesn't matter basically where it comes from and how it was made and how difficult it was to make it. Yeah, you can spend an awful lot of time on making something very complicated, and then it turns out it's not useful at all. You probably have this experience. Whereas you might find that something very simple is extremely useful. Water, for example, is extremely useful, but it's actually very easy to make. To be precise, it's not being made at all. It is just found and bottled. That's how easy it is. But it is probably the most useful of all things. So when treating of use value, so when discussing use value, we always assume to be dealing with definite quantities, such as dozens of watches, yards of linen or tons of iron. Use values of commodities furnish the material for a special study, that of the commercial knowledge of commodities. Use values become a reality only by use or consumption. So something only becomes a use value. So this is basically Marx describing how this concept is used in political economy. So a particular thing, let's say water, is a use value only at the point when humans drink that water. Otherwise it is just water. It is not a use value or any value or anything. It's just a material thing in nature that is there irrespective of whether there are humans. Obviously water has been around much longer than we have, and before we were there, certainly water was not a use value. Water was just water. So it becomes a use value at the point where we are using it, because use value is a societal category, is a category of human society. So you see here lots of footnotes that we are not looking at now. But you might want to look at them because they are historically extremely interesting to see what Marx is working with when he writes this. So, they also constitute the substance of all wealth. Whatever may be the social form of that wealth. So, this is quite typical of Marx's language. We have the substance of wealth and we have the form of wealth. So this goes back to what I said already, that Marx's presupposition here is that wealth takes different forms in different societies. So the substance of wealth is basically the utilities of all kinds of things that are constituted as being useful and thereby constituting wealth in society. And then that wealth takes a particular form. And now it comes. This is sort of the super heavy sentence, this one here. In the form of society we are about to consider, our modern society, not any society, only this particular society. In this form of society, these useful things, the utilities, are in addition the material depositories of exchange value. Now, exchange value is the sort of complementary concept to use value. Now, all things that constitute wealth in any kind of society are useful within the context of that society, but exchange value for Marx is a specific category that only applies to our type of society. So it's very important to keep that in mind when reading further down, that everything that follows in the 3 volumes of Capital and beyond is an analysis of the form of wealth in a particular type of society, namely our society. And exchange value is one of the specific categories deployed for that purpose. So Marx goes on, exchange value presents itself as a quantitative relation, as the proportion as the proportion in which values in use means use values, of one sort are exchanged for those of another sort. That is the first definition of exchange value. So exchange value is the proportion in which different quantities of different useful things are exchanged, of course, only in the context of a society where people exchange things according to certain proportions. Now the question is, if you think about this in a sort of abstract manner, if you think of any kind of society where people exchange things in some way, they must figure out how much of one thing should be exchanged for how much of some other thing. That is what we're looking at, and that is basically the idea of exchange value. A relation constantly changing with time and place. So again we have here the emphasis on the historicity and also the societal and, if you like, geographical specificity of all these categories. So the meaning of all these things depends on history and society. Hence, exchange value appears to be something accidental and purely relative, and consequently an intrinsic value, i.e. an exchange value that is inseparably connected with, inherent in commodities, seems a contradiction in terms. And that is sort of the sort of puzzle that Marx starts out from. So on the one hand this seems completely accidental, but on the other hand it looks like these proportions are somehow inherent in these useful things. So we should sort of speed this up a little bit, otherwise this lecture will take 5 or 6 hours, like a Communist Party conference speech or something like that. Let's have a look. Well, we have to read this, I guess. A given commodity, such as a quarter of wheat, a quarter is a measurement of wheat, is exchanged for a certain quantity of blacking. I think blacking is somehow a kind of something like shoe polish or something, or some kind of substance used for, I think, making things black, obviously, such as shoes. Y amount of silk or Z amount of gold, etc. In short, for other commodities in the most different proportions. So obviously you when you exchange things in society, you only exchange things that are concretely different. Otherwise there would be no point, no? So you don't exchange things that are identical, in which case it would be pretty idiotic to exchange them. So you exchange things that are different, but you exchange them in a particular proportion. And in that proportion comes sort of, if you like, the sense of justice or fairness. So people think an exchange is fair if it is done according to some idea of what the right proportion should be, in which different quantities of these very different things are exchanged with each other. Therefore, first, the valid exchange values of a given commodity express something equal. Secondly, exchange value generally is only the mode of expression, the phenomenal form, so the form of appearance, that means, of something contained in it, yet distinguishable from it. So again, this is sort of the puzzling, the kind of the puzzle that Marx starts out with, namely the question whether this proportion is accidental to the things themselves or somehow has something to do with these things. So let's take, for example, corn and iron. The proportions in which they are exchangeable, whatever these proportions may be, can always be represented by an equation in which a certain quantity of corn is equated to some quantity of iron. 1/4 of iron is X centiweight of iron. Centiweight is a measurement of weight, obviously. What does this equation tell us? It tells us that in two different things, in 1/4 of corn and in X centiweight of iron, there exists in equal quantities something common to both. So this is a sort of kind of an important formulation here. Something is in these, something is there, some mysterious substance is there that is common to these two things that are totally different. Corn and iron are obviously concretely completely different sort of things. Even more so the other examples he's given before, like blacking and silk and iron and corn and whatever. So concretely very different things. There are different quantities of them, but the fact that we treat them as equal presupposes that we must have in our mind some kind of idea that there is something in them that they have in common. Now the question is, what is this something? Obviously the answer, I can give you the answer already. This something is called value. That's basically the subject matter of Marx's argument here. Would be nice if this page wouldn't just jump like this, but okay, where are we? Huh? Aha, here we are. So these two things, corn and iron or whatever, or silk and blacking, or what you want, must be equal to a third, which in itself is neither the one nor the other. So they must be reducible to this third thing, of which we don't quite know what it is. Now he gives an illustration as sort of he tries to illustrate this point, or he tries to illustrate specifically the idea of abstraction here, and he uses the example of geometry. So in geometry, I don't know how good your memory of geometry at school is. If you want to calculate the area of rectilinear figures, you basically divide them into triangles, and because the area of triangles you can calculate quite easily. The area of a triangle is expressed by something totally different from its visible figure. That is the main point here. So namely half the product of the base multiplied by the altitude of the triangle. I assume you sort of remember this kind of thing, how you calculate the area of a triangle. Now this formula, half the product of the base multiplied by the altitude, is completely different from what the area actually looks like. So the form of appearance of the area of the triangle is completely different from what it essentially, if you like, is, namely how we can calculate it. So that is sort of an example that Marx uses. I don't know if you find that particularly helpful as an example, but obviously Marx was actually quite well trained also in maths and such things, probably unlike most of us. So he found this is a very obvious illustration of the concept of abstraction, basically. So we are abstracting from the specific figure of the area of a triangle by using completely different quantities, which, however, allow us to calculate this area. So in the same way, the exchange values of commodities must be capable of being expressed in terms of something common to them all, of which thing they represent a greater or less quantity. So if you now think of a whole sort of a series of triangles that all have different shapes but the same area, That would be sort of the process of abstraction that Marx has in mind here. So you can think of infinitely many triangles that all look different concretely, so they have a different concrete form, but they would have the same numerical area, because yeah, I don't think I can explain that any further, but I hope you know what I mean. In the same sense, you would have infinitely many different commodities that all have the same exchange value. So that would be similar to having infinitely many triangles that are all different, but they have the same area. That is the illustration Marx is using here. So this common something, that is here the sort of the technical term Marx uses, the something, the mysterious something, which we will in a minute reveal by the name of value, cannot be some natural property of these commodities, because it is common to all kinds of things, useful things, that are materially totally different from each other. These natural properties, so the natural properties of commodities claim our attention only insofar as they affect the utility of those commodities, right? So the concrete characteristics are only relevant for the usefulness of these things, because the usefulness depends on what they actually are, and that's what makes them use values or useful things. But the exchange of commodities is evidently an act characterized by a total abstraction from use value. So in the same way that we are abstracting from the concrete form of a triangle when we calculate the area of the triangle, in the same sense we abstract from the specific characteristics of a commodity when we calculate or even talk about its exchange value. Then one use value is just as good as another, provided only it be present in sufficient quantity. And this is sort of one of the key characteristics of the capitalist mode of production, that from the perspective of a capitalist, this I'm kind of jumping hundreds of pages forward here, but just to remind you of what we are actually talking about here in a sort of abstract and basically extremely simplified manner, is for somebody, say a capitalist, who looks at the exchange values of commodities, it basically doesn't matter what specifically the commodities as use values are. And that's one of the key things in capitalism, and one of the reasons that an extremely wealthy society may decide to produce things that are perhaps totally useless, or not totally useless, that are of, say, very limited or very specific use value, when perhaps other use values would be required, but they are not being produced because they would not lead to the same amount of exchange values. So that is sort of implied in this entire argument here, and that's obviously one of the principal characteristics, and of course from Marx's perspective one of the problems, or perhaps the fundamental problem of the capitalist mode of production, that there is this disjunction built into this abstraction. It's only really quantity here what matters. Yeah, so there's further illustration of this point here. And here the summary of the same point. As use values, commodities are of different qualities, but as exchange values, they are merely different quantities. Consequently, do not contain an atom of use value. So if you look at a commodity only under the perspective of what its exchange value is, then it is completely irrelevant what exactly that is. Whereas if you look at that commodity under the perspective of its use value, then it absolutely matters what specifically it is and what the material qualities are, because from its specificity derives its use value. So, and here is now the sort of early statement or the early conclusion, if you like, or a first kind of conclusion from this argument. If then we leave out of consideration the use value of commodities, they have only one common property left, and that is that they are all products of labor. That is the only common something, this third thing, that allows us to equate and to compare and to measure different commodities with each other or against each other. They're products of labor. But even the product of labor itself is undergone a change in our hands. If you make abstraction from its use value, so this is the process that he has just described here, we make abstraction at the same time from the material elements and shapes that make the product use value. We see in it no longer a table, a house, yarn, or any other useful thing. Its existence as a material thing is put out of sight, bracketed out. Neither can it any longer be regarded as the product of the labor of the joiner, the mason, the spinner, or of any other definite kind of productive labor. So if we bracket out the specific material qualities of the commodity, then we also bracket out the specific characteristics of the specific labor that produced this specific commodity. We put out of sight, we bracket out both the useful character of the various kinds of labor embodied in them. Right? Labor is embodied in the things that this labor has produced, and the concrete forms of that labor. Again, we have here the word form. So we have labor in a sort of abstract sense, and then we have concrete forms of labor. There's nothing left but what is common to them all. All are reduced to one and the same sort of labor, and that's what he calls human labor in the abstract. And that is one of the most difficult and most important concepts in Marx's writing, in fact. It's often misunderstood. So abstract labor is not a particular type of labor, but abstract labor means labor looked at in abstraction from any specific characteristics at all. Simply the fact that it is labor under the perspective of how it makes commodities as the products of labor comparable with each other. That is what abstract labor means, irrespective of what specifically that labor is. So in reality, of course, every labor is a specific kind of labor, a specific process. If you abstract from that, if you bracket out the specific characteristics of the labor, what you then get, what you're left with, is labor in the abstract labor. So we're dealing here basically with what he calls an unsubstantial reality. So a sort of almost ghost-like sort of thing is emerging here. A mere congelation of homogeneous human labor. Congelation means basically a sort of a frozen residue of human labor, of labor power expended without regard to the mode of expenditure, without looking at how it was expended. All that these things now tell us is that human labor power has been expended in their production, that human labor is embodied in them. When looked at as crystals of this social substance, common to them all, there are values, and you see it is spelled here with a capital V, almost as if these values are suddenly almost like a person, you could say, or a kind of what kind of things have capital letters here in this context? I don't know, like things that have names, or maybe deities or supernatural forces or something. So the commodities looked at under this abstracting perspective, they are called values. And that is entirely different from their use value. So their concrete specific use values are irrelevant when the commodities are looked at under this perspective. Only their value in this abstract sense, being crystals of abstract labor, matters in this perspective. So, the progress of our investigation, blah blah blah, and so forth. So he's just saying what he's not talking about now in the following. A use value or useful article therefore has value only because human labor in the abstract has been embodied or materialized in it. So again, you can see he does repeat these points with slight variations. How then is the magnitude of this value to be measured? You might remember at the beginning he was saying he would be talking about basically what is the essence of value and what is the magnitude, so the quantity of the value. Plainly, by the quantity of the value-creating substance, the labor contained in the article. So the magnitude of value is determined by the quantity of the substance that creates value, which is labor. The quantity of labor, however, is measured by its duration. And labor time in its turn finds its standards in weeks, days and hours. So we come here to the next category. So we are basically moving from one category to the next. So we have commodity, we have use and exchange value, then we have value as the substance of that exchange value, and then when we look at the magnitude or the quantity of that value substance, we are directed towards the concept of labor, and the measurement for labor is time. That's where we are arriving at. You see, that is the entire thing is a process of abstraction that is here actually quite compressed. We are still on page. This is not a fourth page of this text. You can see up there that is page 4 of almost 900 pages of volume 1. So that's all we're looking at, and we've been talking now for I don't know how much time have we already spent on the first 4 pages. Quite a lot. So you see there's a lot that it requires very sort of very close reading. So then he deals with a possible objection. Basically he says that some people might conclude from this, well, the more labor I spent or the more time I spent on making something, the more valuable it should be. Sadly and obviously that is not the case. So just because you've been slow, it doesn't mean that the product of your work is more valuable. It is not more valuable at all. So he introduces here the notion that this concept of abstract labor again is basically a sociological concept. It is a societal concept because it is the labor time that on average is needed to produce a particular kind of commodity. So irrespective of what every individual needs, what matters is how much time on average all individuals in society that work on this particular commodity, let's say tables, all the people in society who make tables all need slightly different amounts of time to make a table, but the value of a table would be determined by the average of that kind of time. That's what he's explaining here, and he calls this the socially necessary time, the socially necessary labor time to produce a particular commodity on average. So this is a statistical quantity basically, and as such entirely a social category. That is very important. So all these categories Marx is using here are developed by him as societal categories. Labor time socially necessary. Under normal conditions of production, so the time that is necessary under normal conditions. Normal conditions again is basically a reference to statistics. So what is on average? What are the sort of average conditions of production? Obviously all specific people who work on something work under specific conditions, but there is an idea of a normalness of conditions on average. And with the average degree of skill and intensity. So every carpenter obviously has slightly different skills and maybe works more intense or less intense than others. What matters for the determination of value in a society, again, is the average quantity of all these things. So now he mentions here machines. The introduction of power looms reduced the labor time that is required to make cloth. When that happened, obviously the weavers who still used hand looms continued to require the same time as before. And that means that the product of 1 hour of their labor, this is where we are. So they work 1 hour, produce a certain amount of cloth, represented after the change, the change in the average condition of labor, which changed because some people now have power looms, represented only half an hour social labor, because the average time that is needed to make that amount of cloth has dramatically fallen, because some people have these extremely efficient machines, and obviously they produce much more, and for a short period of time at least they are able to sell this much larger amount of cloth they're producing at a lower price than the handloom weavers, but still much more than just half of the price it used to be. So they're bringing down the price of these cloths because their value has reduced, because on average it is less labor time needed to produce a certain given amount of cloth. Very bad news for the handloom weavers, because basically it means after very soon after the introduction of the power looms for some of their competitors, they will only earn half as much money, but they will still working. They will still be working as much as before. So basically that means that the value of their of their products has halved, which obviously is would be devastating for them. So they are forced, and that is the sort of the magic of the capitalist mode of production. They are forced to try and get one of these new machines, so that they can keep up with their competitors and produce at the same level of productivity. So that is sort of implied here in this argument. This is obviously developed much later in the book in more detail. So again, labor time socially necessary for the production of something. Every commodity that is being sold is considered to be an average sample of its class, a certain class of cloth or whatever it may be, although as an individual thing produced by an individual producer, it might have actually taken much more time or much less time to make than the average would indicate. So things have the same value, etc., etc. And here's again a quote. Again, he's quoting himself from a... Oh no, it's not. He's not quoting himself. He's quoting, I don't know, Le Tron, whoever that is. Must be a French political economist. As values, all commodities are only definite masses of congealed labor time, kind of frozen, crystallized labor time. So that is an almost sort of it's almost a theological sort of statement. So it's a kind of a much more than a simple economic point. So it is a very, very strange statement if you just read it several times and think about what that actually means. So these values are very strange sort of mystical things, and he's riffing on the idea of the sort of mystical, mysterious character of these things later on in the first chapter. So I hope you can make a little break in a short time. Let's see, the value of a commodity, blah blah blah, if the labor time required for its production remained constant. So all this changes all the time because everything in society constantly changes. Productiveness turned by circumstances, so it's circumstantial, changes with circumstances, etc., etc. The state of science, so science plays obviously a role because that's how machines are developed and improved. Labor processes are improved through science, etc., etc. Social organization, so again emphasizing that all these are societal categories. So a machine is not just a thing that is somehow devised by science. Obviously science itself is a societal thing, a product of society, the combined knowledge and experience of many people in society. That's what science basically is. But a machine obviously very much is also relying on social organization of production. So there have to be people who know how to use a machine. So they have to act in the appropriate ways, the ways that are appropriate for the machine. So the machine then determines the social organization of labor to an extent. So they determine each other mutually. Probably in most cases, but there is a reciprocity there where also the machine feeds back into the social organization. So a machine basically is social organization, you could say, because a machine is crystallized, organized knowledge. So you can play around with all these concepts, which brings you into a sort of philosophical mood, much more than simply a sort of a normal, regular economics text would. So the way this is written, you can sense from all these things, is very much written in the style of somebody who is by training a philosopher, which is obviously what Marx was, rather than a straightforward sort of economic scientist, if you like, or an economist. So the same amount of labor in favorable seasons, again, so this is another element of contingency that comes in, seasons, what kind of harvests you have, etc., etc. If you have a favorable season, then you will produce more corn with less work, etc., etc. So you have all these factors going in there. Same with metals and mines, diamonds, etc., etc. So we can kind of jump through this. He gives some examples about diamond mines. Okay, we can sort of jump over this at the moment. He talks about the productiveness of labor, etc. All that is relative to society. Vice versa. Productiveness of labor, blah blah blah. So now comes again something that is important to look at. A thing can be a use value without having value. That is the case whenever its utility, its usefulness, is not due to labor. For example, I'm sure you can think of some examples, but the examples are coming here right away. Air would be the most obvious example. Air is extremely useful, but it is not produced by man, by humans, by society. Yeah, man here means human being. In fact, it's an old-fashioned use of language here. Air is of enormous utility, but it's not a value because it was not produced by us. So from the perspective of political economy, and that is, again, this is one of the principal problems of capitalism, is that air, clean air, is basically without value. It doesn't appear in the books of a capitalist because it is not produced by man, by human beings, by society. It is just there. It's just there for the taking, and that is obviously a huge problem. Same about virgin soil. So we haven't produced the soil, we have just taken the soil and distributed it somehow so that people claim it's theirs. But as such, it doesn't have value, or it does not constitute value in the economic sense, because it is simply natural wealth. Wealth because it has utility, but not value. And obviously, if an economic system or a mode of production in society considers many of the most important things, such as air and soil, as basically being valueless, so they kind of are off the radar in the calculations of that system, that, you can imagine, might very well lead to some significant problems, because there would be that would totally distort the perception of what is actually wealth in society. And I don't need to emphasize that these are in fact discussions we have now very much and very intensively all over the world. What is actually wealth? And probably most people would agree that air and soil and water, that's the things that really constitute wealth, but they do not constitute value in the sense of the capitalist, or the way wealth is quantified within capitalist society. That is the distinction towards which this entire argument here runs towards which this entire argument runs. So, and things can also be the product of human labor without being a commodity. So, for example, gifts. So I can produce something, and thereby this something, and I can produce something useful and just give it away as a gift. Then it's not a commodity, and it's thereby not a value, because it is, although it is a product of human labor, but I wouldn't quantify that labor. So I don't write down how many hours I used for making this gift, which I then give away for free. So it's not a commodity, but hopefully still useful, or maybe even very useful, maybe even more useful. Who knows? That is irrelevant. That is an sort of unrelated question here. So if I produce things for myself, like if I cook for myself, for example, then I'm producing a utility. So the meal that I'm producing is a use value, but it's not a commodity because I'm not selling it. I'm just eating it myself. So it's a product of my labor, and it's useful, but not a commodity. So if the thing is useless, and this is also a very important and sad experience. So I may perhaps produce something with my labor, so it is a product of labor, and I'm thinking of it as a commodity because I would like to sell it, but then nobody buys it. So nobody recognizes or appreciates the utility of the thing that I have produced. Then unfortunately the labor that I have used to make this thing doesn't count as labor and creates no value, because I've basically just wasted my time on something useless. Even though I might perhaps think it is useful, and it is perhaps useful for myself, but if nobody else thinks it is useful enough for them to buy it, then it will thereby not be a commodity, and thereby not be a value. So that is the end of the first section here, where he introduces some of these basic categories, and I need a quick break now, and then I'll continue with the second section in the next installment of this video. Thank you very much. See you back in a short minute.